like to thank the organizers. You may understand in the States we have an expression called a tough act to follow. They gave me a very tough act to follow. I'm not going to be as erudite, I think, as Ross is, but Ross is one of the original thinkers in the world now, so I'll do my best to follow him. Now, if you're interested in sport, the guy on the left, Eamon Coghlan, this is a 1983 World Championship 5,000 meters. He's 110 meters from the finish, and he's shaking his hands like this because he knows he's won. That's where every athlete wants to be. If you're a trainer, if you're a physiologist, if you're a physician that works with them, in other words, support team, that's where you want to be. On the other end of the continuum, Paula Radcliffe for many years was so far the best marathon runner in the world that it didn't matter. This is from 2006 in Athens. Now, admittedly, she'd had a few injuries that year. She was facing an enormous heat challenge because of the timing and the weather in Athens. And she frankly ran a stupid race. She went out and attacked in the heat, and she could have won 6 dozen other ways. Well, she wound up sitting on the curb watching the marathon go by. And that's, if you're Paula Radcliffe, obviously you don't want to be there, but you don't want to be her coach, you don't want to be her trainer, you don't want to be her physician because something went wrong. So how do we differentiate? How do we keep ourselves into the left box where we get the success we want? Now you got to think broadly and conceptually. Every single thing we do is trying to make people better. We're trying to improve performance. That's our business. But we also have to deal with the fact that there's some bad things that happen. And for example, I'm using an example here of training intensity, but good things happen, but they happen with diminishing returns. So you go up and it flattens out. If you're a high-level athlete, it never quite flattens out, so you try to do more and more higher quality training. By the same token, there's bad things that happen, and if you're an athlete, you can get injured. That's a bad deal. You can have functional overreaching. Well, you can get over that pretty well, but non-functional overreaching pretty well destroys the season, and if you get whatever this weird thing called overtraining season is, your season's over at least, and maybe your career's over. But you take a calculated risk to say, okay, I'll give everything I have for the chance of being on the top step. For me, most of my life, I make my life working with patients, and so I'm going to accept a lot smaller side effect or a lot smaller effect because the side effect might be that they're dead, which means I sort of failed in my job. And so everything we do is fitting people into this continuum, and you have to keep that in mind as your conceptual thing. So do you need to monitor athletes? I think, yeah, you do. You want to know if they're getting better. If you have a plan, are they following it? Does it fit? Does it work? Are they decompensating? And then how much technology you need to use? You're going to hear me stand up and say I'm not that big of a fan of technology for coaches. I think we've over-deployed it. I think technology is wonderful in the lab, but you got to find simple ways to do things. Now, just last month, John Kiley from England wrote a really sort of neat paper on periodization and maybe trying to force us to think about it a little differently. I encourage you to read it, but it's dense as hell. It's hard stuff to get through. But when you read it, you're sort of hitting yourself on the head saying, there's more to it, because we think in the old days, periodization, you train hard and you recover. You train harder and you recover. You train even harder and you recover. And you just go back and forth in cycles, and you can define details of periodization. Probably the details are not that important. It's train hard and recover, train hard and recover. Well, Kiley says, well, maybe there's a variety of other things we need to be thinking about. I spent most of my sporting science life working with speed skaters, and the upper left is Eric Heiden. 1980, he won every medal that they had at the Olympic Games in speed skating. If they'd had more races, he would have won them too. He was that dominant. Well, Eric, who's now an orthopedic surgeon, a very bright guy, he was unique in the sense you could not create a workout that he couldn't recover from. He's just a freak, he could recover. He almost destroyed USA speed skating because the coaches said, well, if you want to get Eric's results, you need to do what Eric does. Well, that means that puts everybody in the hospital or gives them overtraining. We invented overtraining syndrome. Steven Seiler came up with a concept a long time ago, which again, everybody knew, but he put data on it. is this sort of career progression of athletes. You can't expect to do with a 16-year-old what the champion is doing. And if you have a promising, talented 16-year-old could come into your group, you can't throw them into the champion's training program. If you do, you're just incompetent. You shouldn't be coaching. It takes time to get there. You also have to think about general stress. This is Sheldon Cooper, which is what my students call me, because he's so smart, he's stupid. But he stresses out about everything. Well, athletes who are stressed out about everything, what if you've got a job? What if you've got social problems with your significant other? What if you're traveling around a lot like Ross does? You can't handle the training load that you can when you're sitting there fat and sassy and sleeping and training and sleeping and training. And then with acknowledgments to time progression, the lower right is a guy named Al Order, who was a 4 times consecutive Olympic discus champion beginning in 1956. He did virtually nothing in between that in terms of world rankings, and yet he always came up as a dark horse to win the Olympics. Now, acknowledging that was a period where steroids were emerging, I have no idea if Al Order was on steroids, but the time is right. He made the observation that he thought an elite athlete had 4 years at the top in terms of physical wear and tear, social wear and tear on your life. He chose to have his 4 years as separate years. I don't think you can do that today, but there's a point. You've got to pick and choose when you're going to be good and when you're not going to be good. And so if you're going to monitor training, what is it? It's trying to see if you're getting better in smaller units than competitive cycles. I mean, if you're an elite triathlete, you do, 2 Ironman length events per year, maybe 3? I mean, how do you know if you're getting better? It's too long to wait. And so you got to do something like that. And one of the things I think we've forgotten, and I'll show some detail on it later, is the idea of an index workout, to do a certain workout every week or every other week. And it's a workout. It's not a training session. It's not a time trial. But it shows you that you're progressing. And we've sort of forgotten about it because we got too many other tools. You want to know if the details of the program are being executed. I worked for 20-something years of my career at a medical center, and I'm pretty convinced that physicians are smart people. I'm pretty convinced that if you go in and you're sick and you do what the physician tells you to do, you usually get better. I think that coaches are pretty smart people, and if athletes go do what coaches tell them to do, they usually get better. I'll show you data later that athletes don't do what coaches tell them to do. I think a lot of this monitoring makes better coaches just as it does physicians. And then you have to think about, is it external training or internal training? And if you think about it, if I went out and did a run with you guys and we ran the same pace and we ran 8-minute miles, you'd think, geez, I'm just getting warmed up. I'd be thinking, where's the hospital I need to go because I'm having a heart attack? So external training pace is within a person, it's a useful thing. Between people, it gets us in trouble. And internal training is what people respond to. Now, who cares about this? Now, I think we are all in the same category. Physicians, they're saying, what's the problem? Coaches are saying, why can't Carl run a 4-minute mile? Back in the day, I couldn't quite break 4.5-minute miles. I tried very, very hard, but I just wasn't very good. And the coach is saying, okay, what's the diagnosis? Well, Carl's got no talent is the simple diagnosis. If you're a physio, if you're a rehabilitation specialist, if you're a personal trainer, you're asking the same 4 questions that we got at the bottom. And so you're trying to see what's wrong. You're trying to figure out a way to solve the problem. You want to know if the fix is being done, and then you want to know if it worked. The other thing in terms of laboratory testing, I love laboratory testing. I've done a lot of it. But the value is not in the physiology. It's not in the numbers. This is an American speed skater. This is the basement of the laboratory, or the basement of the dorm in Calgary, where we went to do some studies. They're doing a 10K time trial. Well, I can get numbers. I get lactate, I get heart rate, I get power output, I get all sorts of neat, sexy numbers. The advantage is the coach can look in the athlete's eyes under peak stress. And in fact, this athlete failed just about at this moment. And I looked over at the coach, and he just nodded his head and said, yeah, that's what I've been thinking. But normally when an athlete's going under full speed, they're way away from you. They're going by fast. You can't look in their eyes and see what's in their soul. Similarly, in the exercise lab with a patient, you can tell me how many watts they went, you can tell me what their ejection fraction is, you can tell me what their ECG is, but if I can look in their eyes when they're exercising, I know what's going on with them. And so the big advantage of a lot of this technology is it just lets you see into your athlete's soul, and that informs what you're doing as a coach. Well, you got a historical problem here. You got to have standard conditions. Arne Anderson and Gunnar Haag back in the 40s, they're running here. This is a race. Well, you'd like to know how they're doing, but look at the track. Cinder tracks are really good if they're nice, but in Sweden in the summer, that's as good as it gets, and it's still not very good. If you're a Norwegian skier, well, the Inuit have 1,000 words for snow, so what do you got? This, folks, speaks pretty much for itself. The guy in the white sweater is Gunnar Haag, who was one of the two great runners in the 40s. But what's his training load? Can you measure his external training load? It's meaningless. So how do you measure this stuff? Now, this is data that is sort of amalgamated from Roger Bannister's reported training leading up to the first 4-minute success. His coach, Frans Stampfel, had the idea that you start in the fall and you start running a certain workout, in this case, 10 times 400 meters on a 3-minute send-off. And you see how fast they can run the set. It's not an all-out effort. It's a heavy, hard, nasty training session, but it's not a race. It's a training session. And over the course of the year, he tries to build them down to where they're going faster. The premise being that in a 1-mile run, you can just about average you can just about run with this pace you can average in this. Well, so they built down, and with all apologies to England in 1954, the weather is miserable, the tracks are cinder, they're not good. It's amazing that they got this kind of quality data. But then Frans Stampfel was a genius because they got down toward about a month and a half before they sort of thought they might want to have the run, and the boys just completely stagnated. We didn't call it overtraining in those days. They got flat. And Frans was smart enough that he said, look, boys, I want you to get on the train and go to Wales. I want you to hike around for a week, drink beer, chase girls, do whatever you want to do, and then come back in a week. And the progression started again. But if you don't see this with some regularity, how do you know if they're performing better? Our entire job is to make people perform better. If they perform better, they will eventually succeed. The equation there is really pretty straightforward, but you have to be able to see it. Well, the problem is if you're going to use a laboratory, how often am I going to get Roger Bannister in the laboratory? The coach is going to think he's missing training if he comes to my lab, and it's going to take me a month to get him some sexy results, and yet here you can get it in the middle of a workout. We've forgotten a lot of this, folks. And so one of my big concerns in all of this is we get too much information. We can swamp ourselves, and then you got to ask, what are coaches going to make their decisions on? What are physicians going to make their decisions on? You got to have a fairly constrained information stream to help people make decisions. So then we can think about internal training load because we know that's what responds, and you want the guy on the left who's winning a race or has just supported his teammate to win a race, as opposed to a guy who's just dropped out of the tour. Because whatever happened, the guy on the left did something right, the guy on the right did something wrong. And internal training load is perceptual. When you go out, you have some expectation about what it's going to feel like, and then you're halfway into the run and saying, oh my God, what am I doing to myself? So you got to remember that. Now, it's important that this goes back a long way. It goes back into the 1930s. Gerschler and Reindel in Germany, following up on some work that had been done in Sweden, came up with the idea of running to 180, recovering to 120, back and forth, back and forth. If you couldn't do that, it was time to end the workout. Well, a couple have thought, it was brilliant and it worked and it opened interval training to everybody, and interval training works, but we still don't really know why it works, folks. Think about it first. Where did 120 and 180 come from? I've asked everybody I know, and nobody knows where it came from. Now, I haven't got deep enough into the old German literature, and my German's pretty not so good, but it sort of seemed to come out of somewhere. And then look at the picture. They're exercising a runner. Gordon Pieri, in this case, is one of the world's best 5,000-meter runners, supine on a bicycle. Now, runners do not do supine bicycling very well. You can take that at the bank. And so all their physiology is based on a situation that's completely silly. But in 1939, that was good science. I mean, science is self-correcting, so we made better, but still, where did they come up with 180 and 120? We have no idea. Later on, we came back out and figured out how to do lactates and how to do gas exchange, and we said, boy, this anaerobic threshold, or whatever you want to call it, that's the cat's meows. It's the best mixture of intensity and duration. And so people like Wilder Holman, Bertel Schardine were saying, okay, everybody should train right at threshold. For years in the lab, I was finding the threshold for athletes and saying, this is your best, this is your window, this is where you should be. Steven Sauer came along a few years later and said, well, it's funny, athletes don't do that at all. But so we have ideas, but our ideas are always sort of dicey. Then we went through this technological revolution. I'm old enough to have palpated my pulse rate. I didn't even know what a heart rate monitor was. Then we got one of those. Now we got heart rate monitors that do everything for you. You can do the same thing with VO2. We can do the same thing with lactate. Notice the YSI, when the first portable lactate analyzer came out, said, this is your coach. Is there anybody in this room that believes a lactate analyzer is a coach? I hope not. Coaches are coaches, and they have tools, stopwatches and lactate analyzers and power meters, but lactate analyzers aren't coaches. And then we used to take times for how fast people could run or go. Now we got devices that do this, and we get a lot of data. And think about it, if you've got your Fitbit, you can do your workout and go home and geek out for the next 3 hours looking at what your body did. But is that any use? And a coach who's coaching 30 athletes, can they geek out for 2 hours on every athlete? They simply can't do it. We've got so much information that we're in the forest and we can't see the tree we need to chop down. And so we come up with things like lactate profiles, which give people magic heart rates, and yeah, they're useful, but we may have bought ourselves a device we don't need. And so when we get total physiology, all we want to know is my blood pressure medicine working? I could go to the machine on the left. Alternatively, I go to the extreme right and I get total physiology, but I got so much information. What's it going to do for my coach? How's it going to inform my coach so that my coach can help me better? That's the real dilemma in a lot of this stuff. Again, my theme is be careful of too much information. I am not a curmudgeon. I do not hate technology. I love toys. I think a lot of the people outside are doing really, really neat stuff. And if you look at the left picture, I know you don't believe that's me, but it is, in 1974. And in 1974, that was sexy technology. So I love technology. It's neat stuff, but I don't want to get people trapped into only thinking about technology. Likewise, most physicians, if they do a history and physical on a patient, they know 90%, maybe 95% of what they need to know. Yeah, it's nice to have better and better imaging. It narrows the range for error, but it takes more time, it takes more resources. So maybe we need to focus on doing the upper left better. So to me, on the left, the guy in the blue shirt is Joost de Koning, who's my long-term research collaborator. On the right, the lady is an elite Dutch speed skating coach named Ingrid Paul. I think she's even coached here in Canada. The point for me of technology is to help guys like me and Joost talk to Ingrid in a relaxed environment, saying, hey, look, I'm seeing this and I think it's important, or I just read about this and I think it's important. That's where the second talk this morning was information, applying information at the point where it needs to be applied. Now, I could not give a talk on monitoring without giving due diligence to Eric Bannister, who used to be over at Simon Fraser. Eric was one of the smartest people I ever knew. He defined the term obtuse in the sense that Eric could really get into the weeds and talk about everything. He's a good friend, but I had a headache after talking to him for an hour. But he came up with the idea of the TREMP, where you could measure the stress going into the body using a heart rate monitor, and then look at performance. And he came up with a pretty simple idea that when you train, you get in better shape, and when you don't train, but you also get fatigued. And when you don't train, your fitness goes away, but your fatigue goes away faster. And so you can predict when you're likely to have a good performance. Now, with all respects to Eric, this data is based on the 4 guys who worked in the lab. People like me who went out for a run every day at noon, and they measured their time periodically, and they had their heart. So the data is really pretty thin. It's unbelievably mathematically complicated, but the concept is brilliant. When I first read his papers, that was what I spent half my life in this pose, hitting my head because somebody does something totally brilliant. But then I thought about it. One day, an accident happened to me, a serendipitous thing. I was working out in the lab. You know, is one of these gray November afternoons in Wisconsin. I'd finished my workout. I'd taken a shower. I was sitting in exactly the posture of the guy in blue on the bench in the locker room and said, wow, that was hard. And this little light bulb went on in my head, and I thought, wow, that's interesting. I was used to using the Borg scale in the sense that how are you doing right now? But I'd never thought about using it as a whole thing. And then literally the same day I got home, and my kids came home from soccer practice, and we asked them, well, how was workout, honey? That's what you ask when your kids come home from practice. And the coach tried to kill us. We ran and ran and ran. I nearly threw up. I hate soccer. I want to take up music. And the other one came home and said, oh, no, the coach just talked and talked. And we had to sit on the ground, and the ground was cold, and my butt froze. I hate soccer. Can I take up music? One of my kids is a musician. And so I thought, wow, that's sort of interesting. Maybe people are using verbal expressions to explain broader concepts, and maybe that tells us something. And so I thought, well, if that's true, we're using heart rate reserve as our best heart rate tool. So I took a bunch of people to the lab, threw them on the treadmill, said, work out. I measured their heart rate. I asked them, how was your workout, honey? I had to drop honey after a while because people didn't like that. And the correlation is very high. So a simple question tells me what heart rate is. I brought a bunch more people, and I put them on the treadmill or the bike, stuck holes in their fingers so I could get lactate. And what I found is that when the session RPE, the whole workout, was easy, the lactate was almost always low. And when the session RPE was high, the lactate was almost high. So now the 2 dominant technologies that everybody wanted to use at the time, this was 1995, a long time ago, I can get by asking, how was your workout, honey? And so I thought, wow, that's sort of interesting. Sally Edwards is a good friend. She wrote the book on the heart rate monitors when they came out. And she'd come up with her own concept of zones. I mean, I think that's unique to her. Later on, we had to modify it because Sally had 5 zones that were sort of arbitrary. You can really only define 3 in terms of physiology. But then we came up with the idea that you could, if you look on the right, you can give points for the time in the zone. So a low zone you get less points for. A high zone you get more credit for. So we could come up with a number, in this case 86, which tells me that was that workout. Now, it does a bunch of good things. First, Eric Bannister was too computationally complicated. Second, he used average % heart rate reserve. What athlete runs steady state all the time? Intervals are important to athletes. You got to find a way to account for them, which Eric's data didn't do. Then you have to anchor every training session with a test. Now, you guys train people that have 3 primary events, and they might also do a few other cross-training kinds of activities. How many exercise tests are you going to do to anchor all this stuff? What kind of resources do you have when you're talking about 14-year-old kids? You just don't have the resources. What if the monitor fails? Does that mean you didn't work out? That happens a lot. I work with speed skaters. I love speed skaters, but they're dumb. Would you go out in your underwear and go 30 miles an hour in Edmonton in the winter? Speed skaters do. I mean, they're dumb. And so half the time they forget to bring their heart rate monitor. Does that mean they don't have a workout? Then also with the speed skaters, they do a lot of hoppy, bouncy, plyometric-y, weightlifty stuff. They're like Tigger, you know, in the Winnie the Pooh stories. If their heart rate could be 400 beats a minute, it would be, but it can't be. So how do I use the heart rate monitor? Works great for steady state bike riding or steady state running, but doesn't work so well with interval training. And then what about high intensity training, which is a problem? And so we came up with a really simple one, and I've got to apologize to all the true RPE people in the world. Gunnar Borg's a very old man right now, but he turns over every now and then and says, "Damn Foster." Because when they created the perceived exertion scale and its modification, the category ratio scale, they picked very specific words. They used, for example, light exertion. Well, if you're from Britain, you understand what light exertion is. Americans, or people from the States, we're so imprecise with our language use, we have no idea what light exertion is. But I said, easy. I said, oh, okay, I understand that. And then Borg and them used the term severe. What does severe exertion mean? If you're a British-speaking person, that makes perfect sense. To an American, at least south of the border, they don't know what severe exertion is, but they know what the word hard means. So we changed words, we added cartoons, we added colors. They think I'm the worst thing that ever happened, but it works. And so we came up with this, and we said, tell us how was your workout? We waited about 30 minutes, but it turns out that's not even a critical number. And then we multiplied the duration by the number of minutes, and then you sum it up over the week. If you do 2 workouts a day, you got to sum it up. And for about 80% of people, they'll do this. The other 20% will be accountants, and they'll have to tell you separately about the warm-up and the middle of the workout and the cool down, but then you just got to play their game with them. At about the same period of time, we were thinking about this, and overtraining syndrome was still a big dilemma. We didn't know what it was. We didn't know how to get it measuring. Well, it turns out horses get a version of overtraining syndrome. You know, if I get overtraining syndrome, who cares? My girlfriend cares. My cat cares. Nobody else in the universe cares. But racehorses, if they get it, somebody loses a lot of money. And so Gerrit Brown in the Netherlands, working with Harm Kuipers, got this big horsey treadmill. And they got horses, and they could run them till they went backwards off the treadmill, so they had to measure performance. And then they started training them, and this is schematic. It's not a certain number of days, but in the lower left, they trained them hard day, easy day, hard day, easy day. That's how you train horses. And they had a performance in yellow, and they get better when they train. And then they trained them harder, and you get more better. And then they trained them harder, and you get more better. But notice the curve is already flattening off. And then they said, well, we can't train the horses any harder. They're at the limit. Let's just take away the recovery days. So they cut down the recovery days. The horses immediately deteriorated. It told us in that moment that overtraining syndrome was not overtraining. It was screwing up your recovery. So if you can run a marathon 3 days a week if you're a runner, and probably get away with it if you sit on the couch the other 4 days a week. But you can't run a marathon every day and run 15 miles on the off days. You just can't do it. Then I thought, okay, well, if the problem is not this, is lacking variation in training, hard days and easy days, I had to find a way to express that. And so I said to myself, well, if I looked at something called the coefficient of variation, which is the standard deviation divided by the mean, that's a standard statistics 101 tool. But I wanted bad to go up, and I wanted things that weren't challenging to go up, so I just flipped it over. And I came up with the term monotony. I was actually going to use the term lack of variability, but I was working with a Dutch coach who couldn't say variability. It just doesn't come out of a Dutch mouth. So I had monotony, monotony, not that it's boring, but, and so we have and then if you multiply the amount of training you're doing, the TRIMPs, the load, times monotony, you get a value called, which I called strain, which I think predicts bad things that are going to happen. And then it got really sexy in just a minute here. But you can do this in this way. So you've got Sunday, you go out for an hour, and it's 5, which is hard, so you get a number of points. And you go through the week that way. You need to have high TRIMPs. You need to train hard to turn on protein synthesis, which is what training is about. But you get to, if you have high strain, you're going to get something bad happening. So I can calculate these. I can visualize the variability within the week. I can tell you this monotony number in any serious athlete, if it's above 2, they need a day off. If you take a day of 0, you include it because that changes the total loading on the week. It changes the pattern on the week. And then we did 2 really critical experiments. In the left, I talked to a bunch of speed skaters, and I told you they weren't too smart, to come into my lab and ride to 10 kilometers on this bike that I have. And I convinced them this was a fun thing to do and to keep a diary. And so we did that over the space of several months. And their performances get better as they train more, as they go from the holiday part of the year into the serious, hard training part of the year. So I thought, wow, that's sort of neat. And everybody sort of had the same pattern. So I said, let's just average it. And I'm probably doing things that any statistician would be turning over in the grave on. And so I get an average curve there in the middle left. And it says, well, that's sort of neat. But I said to myself, well, nobody's ever going to train nothing because even when athletes are in vacation periods, they're doing more than most people are doing. So I normalized it to doing 30 minutes at a moderate intensity 5 days a week. Really light, keep fit kind of training. And I get a curve that makes sense for everybody. And then by pure dumb luck, if you go from 500 units a week, which is pretty easy, to 5,000, which is about 2.5 hours at hard every day of the week, so that's pretty significant training. You improve, so a 10-fold increase, you improve by about 10% in a 10-kilometer time trial, which is about an 18-minute effort. I didn't expect 10-fold to be 10%, but that's the way it worked out. And so we know they get better when they train, and it's got a proportional and predictable pattern to it. But then there's the other side of the coin. What happens? Well, we showed in the middle graph here that the heart rate points that I can accumulate in my little "how was your workout, honey" technique give us fundamentally the same answer. And so then I said, when are they deteriorating? I got to figure out a way they're deteriorating. The coaches weren't doing index workouts like I wanted them to do, but athletes get a lot of sniffles and a lot of colds. And in the States, in Milwaukee, we have an indoor ice rink, which is fine. You don't have to be freezing your butt outside, but you're breathing recycled air. And so you get a lot of little respiratory infections. So one of the so-called features of overtraining is respiratory infections. So I plotted them individually, and each little dot up there is a respiratory infection in a given athlete. And then I tried to just move my little curve to where I could explain the most I could. And again, it's a little synthetic, but what I found is that 90% of the time, if they got above their individual threshold, they were going to get sick. Or I could explain 90% of the illnesses by being above this, and strain works better than training load because it includes monotony, which means you got to have rest days in there. Now, in all fairness, about half the time you can successfully get above your own individual threshold and you get away with it. There's a whole bunch of stuff in immunology about I could be very immunosuppressed and there's not a bug floating by, I'm not going to get sick. So there's other issues involved. But then I still want to measure intensity. About the time I moved to lacrosse, we needed some simple theses for master's students. And in Toronto, a guy named Bob Good had many years ago come up with the idea of the talk test, which I heard about years and years ago. We didn't think about it, but we decided to have a student do it. And we thought about it a little bit and said, well, why would you not be able to talk? Well, it's probably because you're having to breathe more, but you're breathing less frequently because you got to suppress your breathing frequency to talk. So we had people do in the upper left a VO2 test where we could identify ventilatory threshold. And it turns out that if they're still talking, we recite a paragraph and ask them if they can speak, they're below their ventilatory threshold. At about the time they start saying, well, yeah, I can talk, but it's getting a little harder, turns out they're right on top of it. And it turns out if they can't talk, they're above it. In fact, they're very close to their second threshold. In the lower left, Jose Rodriguez Moroyo in Spain took some of the best Spanish junior cyclists. These are people that eventually will go on to ride the Tour. And whether it's the first or second threshold, it just lines up. Now, he didn't use the same paragraph I did. He used something in Spanish or whatever. We've shown in the upper right that if you look at the errors you make, if you use about a 90-word paragraph, you hardly make errors in either threshold. It's almost idiot-proof. We've done like 50 studies on this stuff. It's too easy. The reason it works, in the upper graph, in the areas where the red line's going across, when you speak, you have to suppress your breathing frequency. That's going to drop your oxygen uptake. That's not such a big deal. You can make lactate, you can deplete phosphogens, so that's no big deal, but you can't get rid of CO2. What happens when you can't get rid of CO2? Your brain gets really unhappy. Your what we call the end-tidal CO2, which is a marker of your arterial CO2, goes up precipitously. And that tells you your brain that, oh, I'm not happy, I don't want to talk, I want to slow down. So there's a plausible biologic mechanism for all this to work. Then we had a student come by and say, okay, let's see if we can do some workouts. So we put people on it. The last time they said, yes, I can speak comfortably. And if in the upper left, they're going along and they can talk and we don't have to change the speed. Their heart rates in the upper right are in the zones we want them in. The perceived exertion is 3 to 4, which is moderate to somewhat hard, so nice, steady training. And the lactate is basically still at resting level. We brought them back another day and said, okay, let's take them to the point where they said, well, I'm not too sure I can talk. I can, but it's not easy. The speed stays pretty much the same. And notice the error bars here are pretty small. But notice the heart rate is higher. It's high within the normally accepted zones. Perceived exertion at the end is about 5 or 6, which is harder than hard. And the lactate goes up to the point of near the maximal lactate steady state, or 4 millimoles. Now, I'm not having to use a piece of technology at all. All I have to do is say, read this out loud. Can you talk comfortably? I mean, it's pretty idiot-proof. And then we brought him back yet another day and put him at the speed where they said, no, I can't talk at all comfortably. Well, only about 4 of 20 could even finish the 30 minutes. So it's a short workout. Notice that the heart rate is very high. The perceived exertion is now 7 or thereabouts, which is up very high, and the lactate just keeps going. Again, I haven't had to use a single piece of technology. I've had them recite a silly paragraph, and I ask them if they can speak comfortably. How was your workout, honey? Can you speak comfortably? Again, I'm not trying to get rid of technology. I'm just trying to find ways to use it. The other problem coaches have is how do you make decisions on a day-to-day basis? Several years ago, I was sitting at the ice rink waiting to do something. Some athletes were jogging by on their warm-up, and one of them looked at their heart rate monitor and said, wow, my heart rate monitor is really high. I must have cooked myself in training the other day. I thought, that's sort of interesting. Is it possible that we could figure out that athletes were at the point they needed unscheduled rest from something sort of simple? And again, when's the coach going to make the decision to change the workout? They've got a really narrow window to say, well, today you better take off, or else today we're going to go harder because you look so good. So there's been a whole bunch of studies on it. Paul Haber, back in the 70s, had the PWC 170, which is simple and brilliant. Rob Lamberts in South Africa made it more complicated. I went and did a study later, and we made it even more complicated. And yeah, we find that if you get outside of a certain window, yeah, maybe you're not doing so well. But again, I want something that's not complicated, where you can do decision making. So Jose Rodriguez Murillo comes along. Jose's worked with a lot of high-level cyclists. So he got 7 guys that are on a continental team. They're not the top teams that ride the Grand Tours, but they're pretty good cyclists. It took him about 3 years to get 7 of them because he tested them in January when they're sort of out of shape. He tested them about 2 weeks before the Vuelta in Spain. And then he got him to come into the lab on Monday after the Vuelta ends on Sunday. Anybody in this room stupid enough to do that? Jose found 7 of them. It took him a few years. And so he measures things like heart rate, and it moves in predictable directions. It gets, at a certain power output, it gets lower when you're more in shape, and it drifts upward a little bit. But the simple one was perceived exertion. And everybody's going to warm up, aren't they? You can do a warm-up every day. You got an erg, you can put them on a trainer, you can measure power output, and guess what happened? Perceived exertion, you pick a value of about, say, 5 on the perceived exertion scale where it's hard, which is just getting above threshold. You're going to do that in warm-up anyway. The day after the Vuelta, their RPE went back up as if they were totally out of shape. So I thought to myself, wow, we got a really simple tool here. And so here's the Rodriguez Murillo model, and it remains to be tested. In fact, I think it's going to be published this week, but I'm not sure. If you do a standard warm-up, and let's say you're rating it 4 all of the time, the verbal anchor for that is somewhat hard. So you're just coming up on your first threshold. If at some point you stay in that window, you say, okay, well, they're doing as I expected. I've got a workout plan, let's do the workout. On the other hand, if they start increasing their RPE at the same workload, you say to yourself, geez, why are they finding this hard? They're supposed to be getting in better shape. Maybe that's Mother Nature's way of telling you it's time to take an unplanned regeneration day. On the other hand, if their RPE at the same workload starts downward, you say, maybe they're really responding to training. Maybe I need to go up. This is something that's really simple that needs to be tested. I'm also a big fan of questionnaires. There's several good ones out there that are pretty easy to administer, that are pretty easy to score. Romain Musin has a really nice one that's scoreable on a smartphone. And so you can ask people questions about how they're doing, and if the numbers start running in the wrong direction, then you say, well, maybe I need to do something. I met Michael Kelman about 20 years ago, and he was coming up with his rest cue, and I thought it was sort of, what was the word you used? Bullshit? And but I was polite to him. But then I saw him last year at a Congress on monitoring training. I went to him and said, Michael, you were right. You ask people how they feel and you get the answer. So as I get near the end here, the other thing that's important, if you go to your physician and you do what your physician says, most of the time you get better. If you go to an experienced coach and you do what the experienced coach says, most of the time you get better. Well, we were in Calgary with the team before the 92 games. And one day our coach, a guy named Stan Klatkowski, he was Polish, he was always making something. Like one day I went to him and said, Stan, I want to skate better so I can understand better. He said, Foster, you too old, you too fat to skate. But we make special program for you. And in fact, I got better. I still suck really bad, but I got better. Well, one day we went for a run, and there was a recovery day. We were going to do a 40-minute run, and Stan and I were going to run with the skaters. Now, we're two chubby 50-year-old guys, so it ought to be an easy day. Well, of course, the skaters all go zoom and disappear. And we get back to the stretching area, and they're saying, oh, Stan, we're so tired. We're going to get overtraining. And Stan says, if you makes recovery, when I gives recovery, you not once stays off. Hit yourself in the head. So we went back and we did this in the lab. And so we got the coach on our track team to make up a list of how hard he thought the workout was going to be and how long it was going to take. And then we asked the athletes and we did this over several weeks, we asked them to rate it without knowing what the coach said. Well, look what happened. In the lower left, on the days the coach thought was going to be easy, the athletes always did more. On the days the coach wanted to work hard, and in molecular biology terms, that's called disturbing homeostasis, so you turn on protein synthesis, the athletes couldn't work hard because they were too tired. They didn't get better because they're stupid. I mean, it's really that simple. But do you know it? I mean, coaches don't know what their athletes are doing. And very often these days were the easy days, the coach took the day off because that's your chance to do stuff. So if you're going to do this, I encourage you to have people self-monitor, have the athletes do the monitoring, have the athletes do the downloading, have the athletes do the graphing, and then sit down and talk about it. Are you doing what was in the plan? If not, why not? What's the problem? Self-monitoring works, but it's got to be self. So in summary, monitor with a purpose. It's a coaching aid. Do it so you know what you're doing. Do it so that you know the athletes are doing what you want them to do it. And then you want to see progress outside the competitive window. Index trainings, if you will. Make the patient or the athlete do their own graphics. Warm up use warm-ups as a decision point. Index workouts as a decision point. I think monotony and training distribution are big deals. You can use whatever technology you want. Obviously, I'm pretty invested in session RPE. I'm not invested in it because I think it's better, but because I think it's simpler. Yeah, I can measure things more accurately with anything I can get out there in the hall, but I can't do it simpler. And that's a big deal because you've got to be able to deploy this stuff. So you ask questions. How was your workout? Can you talk? So keep it simple, stupid. Now, the last thing, the organizers asked me to put a couple of things in, so I'm responding to that. Pick a way of training. The simpler it is, the better. You got to look at other elements of stress. How many hours are they working? How's their things going with their significant other? If you have to watch The Bachelor to get into the language of your athletes or whatever else, it gets you into their language. I don't think this is gender dependent. So I think it works. In fact, all my studies, I do men and women because I think they're people. And then I think it should not be talent or development related. I think you'll see loadings go up as people's careers progress. But if everybody's coming to you and saying every day is a 9, which is as hard as you can get, and I went 2 hours, folks, it ain't going to go well. So with that, I thank you very much.
We have time for 2 questions.
And see, this tells you also that the thing you should do is to get them to go to my lectures, because it's perfect regeneration training. All my students just have a nice relaxation.
I work with 1 or 2 athletes that really struggle to give me an RP. They think I'm talking nonsense, and I can't see it from their perspective. I don't understand how they can't tell me how hard it was on a scale of 1 to 10. And they just say, like, oh, I don't know, I don't know. Like, have you experienced that before, and do you have any workarounds?
Take the numbers away.
Yeah.
Put the words up. Ask them to tell their grandmother how their workout was. Their grandmother doesn't understand obla. Their grandmother doesn't understand threshold. But if Grandma, it was really, really hard, I'm tired. They just told you it's an 8. But sometimes you have to take the numbers away and then translate, and they'll get used to it. But I know there are a certain number of people out there who have trouble with it. The other thing is you calibrate it in the laboratory. If somebody finishes a maximal exercise test and they're rating at 4, you say, look, we got to have a talk here. If that's a 4, you ought to be on the treadmill for another 20 minutes. So you can teach them, but the first thing I do is just take the numbers away. And then you got to add them back manually.
Within the context of the wearables and the information that is currently available, do you see clearly that session overall being far more important than what is within the context of that? If there's periods of 10 for certain intervals, that session is going to look different than if you just consider that at the end.
Yeah, that's a big open question. It's the one big argument that Steven Seiler and I have all the time. And full disclosure, Steve and I are good friends for a lot of years. And he looks at absolute intensity as his marker when you talk about training distribution. And I say, Steve, what happens on the 4-hour bike ride in zone 1? When you lay your head down that night, you're still going to say, wow, that was a tough one. So it's still a big session. In terms of turning on protein synthesis, you've disturbed homeostasis, but you still may only be in zone 1. So I think that's a problem, and I think that's where session RP is unique. But I think that you need to get people up to where they are turning on protein synthesis. And if you need a tool like heart rate or power or something, it's great. When I ride the bike in the gym, I'm looking at watts all the time, because I have a screwy heart rate, and B, I like watts, but I don't download it or anything. I just know that if I ride a certain number of watts, I can get above a certain value for each interval, and it's not such a bad workout. So to me, it's extremely simple tool, which is why I like it. But you lose information, and it's a trade-off you got to make. By the same token, if you download an SRM, even if you've calibrated against a maximal test, or even if you calibrated against a 20-minute ride or something like that, you still get so much information that unless you're prepared to geek out for 2 hours, and I know a lot of triathletes and runners and cyclists, that's what they do at night after the run. But if you're the coach and you got to be doing the decision making, you don't got 2 hours to geek out. You got to come up with some sort of summary data that says, yes, I pushed him. Today I'm not pushing him. Yes, I pushed him. That's the essence of periodization, with all the other things that John Kiley's telling us we need to think about.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Foster.